Welcome everybody. I'm Scott Alterator. I'm Chair of Learning Environments Australasia, just in case we haven't met before. Thank you for coming along to the webinar this evening, Inclusive Education and Design. I'm going to start with an acknowledgement. I'm here on Janduk, on Jara, which is the country of Jara, the Dja Dja Wurrung people, and I acknowledge Jara as custodians of this land and maintaining ongoing traditions. I want to acknowledge the elders of Jara, past, present and future, and those people from where you're joining us tonight. I think Charlotte's up on Bundjalung country. There's a really excellent panel that you can see before us here. I don't know where everybody else is who have joined us this evening, but when I look out my window to the left here, we're kind of on the eastern edge of Jara country, and then right across to the west as I look out that way, I think of places like Bort and the recent activity out there by an archaeological team to track and to kind of help position the fantastic possum skin ceremonies and possum skin festivals that happened out that way. Fantastic scar trees and stretching trees and a whole range of kind of clues into this fantastic set of cultural practices that are now ongoing thanks to the cultural work that's happening by Jara. And so I wonder what you see tonight when you look out your window. In which direction are you looking? What country can you engage with, and whose traditions are sitting just there? So I want you to think about that this evening as we move into the webinar. And we've got a pretty awesome webinar for you tonight. We've got a fantastic panel who I will introduce shortly. But first of all, I want to just kind of position what we're doing this evening. This is really part 3. This is the third, or even part 4, because we've had 2 previous webinars looking at inclusive education and design with a range of panelists, including principals and architects and specialists who have provided a whole range of insights. And we have recently, or earlier this year, if you managed to attend the symposium in Hobart, you'll have had a pretty intense experience with a range of experts, one of whom is joining us again tonight. So we're really lucky to have Beck on board. And really, so this has been a kind of more than a 2-year conversation for us here at LEA VIC, and we're continuing that with the conference theme for 2024 of Amplify happening in Melbourne, where through Amplify, what we're doing is bringing to the table a whole series of contributors, and we're really looking to amplify the voices of those people who don't normally take center stage. And so there's really kind of been this long conversation that we're trying to add to. And we're really happy to be part of that bigger conversation, because just earlier this year, quite recently, our good friends at Learning Environments Applied Research Network through the University of Melbourne were successfully granted the ARC grant, a substantial project designing learning spaces for diversity, inclusion and participation. So congratulations to Ben Cleveland and the team. It's quite a long study. It's 3 years. It's a substantial study. There's quite a lot of partners involved. We're really looking forward to seeing how the research goes and how the findings can continue to impact this field. So it feels quite nice to be able to say that. I think they've worked really hard, and it's great to be part of that kind of conversation and centre our attention on these issues. Tonight's presentation webinar is supported by Hear and Learn. And to tell us a little bit more about that is David from Hear and Learn. David, the floor is yours.
Okay. Greetings all. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this. I'll keep it short and sweet. Hear and Learn, you may know my name, you may know the name of Daniel Hughes, who attended the symposium in Tasmania recently. We are a federal company, Melbourne-based. We make and import stuff from the US to capture teacher voices, student voices, screen audio, to create a theatre-like environment for a learning space. That's one of our functions. That's known as sound field in the industry. That is regulated in VSBA rules and a few other things. And we seek advice from access consultants and also audiologists to make sure we're aware of the factors relevant to that. But something that's very contemporary and something that's somewhat mysterious to many is this concept called hearing augmentation, which, as you'll know, is regulated by code, which is ancient really in its language. And the new 2023 VSBA building rules have improved the acknowledgement of the need for people like you guys to understand that the technology the kids wear, teachers wear, visitors wear, has evolved significantly and has in the last year. So any traditional approaches, whilst you may think, yep, we've done it that way and it's always worked for us, certainly they don't into the future. We concentrate on working with you guys from the bottom up, building plans, and we figure out for you what the best way to attack that. We can get performance-based reports from access consultants to hold or assure you that it's a valid performance-based solution. We've had a long-standing relationship in the different chapters across Australia with LEA. We love being part of it. We offer a free planning service for you guys. All I encourage you to do is to not abandon tradition, but at least accept that things may have to change. And we work with a lot of you guys anyway, but that's us. And we're very proud of the work we do. And we'll always welcome any criticism or improvements you want to make or challenge us with different applications. We try and do things bottom up. That said, I could talk a leg off a chair, I won't. Thanks for your kind introduction, Scott.
Thanks, David. It's really good that you could be here this evening, and thanks so much for your support. It's clearly a really nice match between the kind of work that you're doing and what we're seeking to explore tonight and have been doing for a number of years. So we really appreciate your support and welcome.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, so we're now going to jump into a discussion with the panel. We've got a range of questions and things to talk about. But then what I'd really like you to be able to do is contribute some questions yourself. And so tonight, what I'd like you to do is use the Q&A function. It's far easier for us to do that, for you to do that, and then for us to be able to kind of manage it. So if you've got a question as we go along, don't hesitate, jump in and pop it into the Q&A function for us. That would be fantastic. So let me introduce this evening's panel. We have, now I'm not sure what the order it is. For me, on my left-hand side, I've got Rebecca Beck-Davis, who's a vision impairment specialist based in Hobart and working with the Department of Education, Children and Young People. And so I mentioned before that Beck was a panelist for the symposium that we held earlier this year, and offered a whole range of insights, which we're really keen to hear about this evening. So welcome, Beck. Next in line, at least the way I'm viewing things, is Charlotte Krelle, who's an OT, an occupational therapist. I shouldn't use acronyms. Sorry, Charlotte. At Max, there I am again, at Melbourne Archdiocese Catholic Schools. She's the senior occupational therapist at Burwood East Special Development School and director and occupational therapist at All of Us Therapy. She's wearing a lot of hats. I've spoken to Charlotte quite a number of times and never walked away without learning something. I'm excited that we all get to hear from her tonight. Welcome, Charlotte. And to my right is Angela, or Ange Buxton, who is principal at Verney Road Special School, which is in Shepparton, for those people who might know Shepparton well enough to know Verney Road. And Ange and I have worked together a little while now, and working in particular on Ange's work on a new school. So an adaptation of an older school site in Shepparton, which has a whole series of challenges, as you might know, through adaptive reuse. But Ange has really had to dig deep on, what is the purpose of inclusive education? What are the elements of the physical environment that allow high quality inclusive education to occur? So I'm really interested to see what you've learnt, Ange, and how this process has allowed you to kind of take your knowledge to the next level. So what I'm going to do is, very quickly, I do this at the start of, we've done this at the start of each of these webinars, so I'll try not to take too long, but I want to just position what we mean by inclusion. And I guess we're kind of excluding a couple of definitions first of all, or at least kind of clearing the air a little bit. When we talk about inclusion, what we're really looking at is for students with special educational needs. There are a range of ways you can approach inclusion, from a cultural perspective, from a gender inclusion perspective, sexuality. We're really focusing in on students with special educational needs. We're not really taking a position on a broader educational question across the globe, which is about how students, or what sort of systems we need for students to be educated, whether they should be in special schools or everybody should be accommodated in mainstream schools. We're going to avoid that debate tonight, and we're going to focus in on the way in which the physical environment can respond to the idea of inclusion for students with special educational needs. And we'll hear a little bit more about kind of contextual versions of those as we speak to our panelists. So what I've done is ask the panelists to begin the session with just a quick sort of 5-minute explainer on their background and their work context and how this impacts or shapes how they think about and interpret inclusion. Ange, I'm going to start with you. I'll have the timer on so we get a chance to move to questions, but the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Scott, and thanks for the invitation tonight. It's pretty exciting to be able to talk to such a broad audience, because as you probably know, we usually just talk to other teachers, so that's pretty exciting in itself. Just a little bit about me. So my current role is as principal of the special school in Shepparton. We have over 250 students now, and they start at 2.9 years. So we have the whole range from early education right through to year 12. I'm also in Shepparton a board member at Connect GV, which is one of the adult facilities for people with disabilities. So I'm pretty connected in this community. It's not where I started. It's not where I started at all. And for people who've been around for as long as me, which is getting close to 35 years now, you might remember the Kennett years. And I don't know that I don't think this should be a political speech, but I don't thank Jeff Kennett for a lot of things, but I do thank him for the fact there were no jobs, and I landed in Robinvale, of all places. And I think that was the making of me. I remember a guidance officer at the time saying, this school will make you or break you, make sure it makes you. A very large career population. It was, in percentage, the second largest in the state at the time, and huge challenges. I'd come out of Melbourne and, quite honestly, probably had never spoken to an Aboriginal person in my life. And I think that's where that part of my inclusion came from, because I still say to this day, one of the huge challenges for teachers in that school, sadly enough, was to challenge their views on racism and to come out not racist. And we know the politics around that. We know how difficult it is. We need to challenge ourselves all the time on that and our views and opinions. And how we see things. how did I get into disability? Just always really interested in it. So after a big stint in Robinvale, I ended up in Shepparton, mainstream secondary school teacher. So I taught English and psychology for many years, and then had an opportunity to do a grad dip in autism teaching. So I did that. Then I went on to a Masters of Education, and then it went into leadership. And I think the challenges around that, and again, that's around my views around inclusion, because without saying I'm perfect, and I'm certainly not, and I don't know everything, what I could see, the reason I became a principal was because I could see that I had learnt a lot along the way, that I could offer some help for others. And for me, it's always about every single child in the school and always putting them at the centre. What I didn't tell you is Shepparton's on Yorta Yorta and Bangarang country, and we consult with both those traditional owner groups. And at the moment, as Scott said, we're consulting with them a lot. So we'll be in the process of choosing a new school name. When you move to a new site, you can't call yourself Verney Road anymore when you're not on Verney Road. Very confusing for everyone. And we'll be consulting with them around that. Also, we are looking at the school design. So I've learnt, Scott says, I have worked with him a bit, and he has absolutely opened my eyes. So I always talk about whatever we're doing in a school. When we've got our strategic plan, I say, what does that look like down in the classroom? And it's actually one of the questions I will often ask teachers when they come in for an interview. What does your ideal classroom look like? And it's one of those challenges, and it changes over time, and it changes with the cohorts you've got, but it's absolutely vital. So I've also been through, my first stint as a principal was in a primary school. So I went from secondary to primary, small primary school, bigger primary school, and then the opportunity for the AP assistant principal position came up at Verney Road. So unusual move to take a step backwards, but it probably shows you how passionate I am about Verney Road. I say it's the best school I've ever been in. I love it. It's what gets me up every morning and gets me going to work, and I feel I'm really, really privileged to be there. I think all these things, all these things have impacted on me as an educator, and my passion around inclusion really doesn't wane at all. And so when I look at it, I look at pathways for the future for every child and the complexities in them, or what are all those little bits that make them up. So not only are we weighing up all the cultural stuff, we're also weighing up what are their skill sets and where do we need to get them. And that's what is absolutely important when you're looking at how a school is structured and functions. And that's about all for me at the moment.
Thanks,
you.
Ange. Having been in your school a number of times across the last year, 18 months or so, I can definitely attest to the passion and the kind of dedication to inclusion. So, yeah, fantastic. Thank you for those opening remarks. That's wonderful. Charlotte, would you mind jumping in and sharing?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Charlotte Krelle. So I'm an occupational therapist, as Scott has mentioned. I've worked across a variety of settings, including special education, mainstream education, and private practice. Prior to being an OT, I worked as a disability development and support officer. So I worked in community residential units with adults with disabilities. And so across my different roles, particularly as an OT, I've really worked to provide direct therapy to children and their families, as well as consultative support to schools regarding individual students and spaces, as well as architects, so consulting on sensory spaces in schools and also sports stadiums. So in the role that I met Scott through, it's for Melbourne Archdiocese Catholic schools. So we go around to different schools based on a referral system and basically just work with teachers, work with learning support officers and leadership teams, and really just collaborate together to share ideas and brainstorm together to make sure that the right supports are in place for the student and to see if anything else can be added or altered or changed. So across all of these roles, I feel like it's been an amazing opportunity to learn from so many different people I've worked with and so many different children that I've worked with. Working in a special developmental setting for so many years, I really believe that I've developed an attitude of assuming competence. And I really believe that every student can learn and every single student has the right to learn. And it's really up to us as the professionals that are supporting them to ensure that we have the adjustments in place to make sure that they're set up for success right from when they start school, right through to when they finish school. And yeah, having worked in these different settings, I've really worked with some children that do present with some very complex learning profiles. But with this right support, they've been able to achieve really, really fantastic outcomes and make really fantastic gains amongst themselves. So I really feel that inclusion is the only way forward. And yeah, I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation and really open to different conversations too, to continue to support in schools in this space.
Thanks, Charlotte. Yeah, and as Charlotte said, our paths crossed on a research project through Max, and yeah, I was immediately struck by kind of how much we can learn from each other and your willingness and curiosity. And yeah, I think that if we can carry that through to this evening and then in all of our work moving forward, I think we'll be in a better position. I think there's a heck of a lot to learn from that. And what Charlotte didn't mention is that she's actually on holiday and joining us tonight from her holiday up near Byron Bay. So thank you again.
Thanks, Scott.
Beck, who's joining us from Hobart.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks, Charlotte, and thanks, Angela. It's really excellent to be here, and yeah, great to have this opportunity to speak to everyone tonight. So I am a teacher, but I'm a teacher of students who are blind or have low vision. Previously, I was an optometrist and low vision clinician, and currently, as Scott said, I have two roles, or at least I work with DSIP, Department for Education, Children and Young People in Southern Tasmania. So my main role is with Accessibility Services, Vision Services, where I support students who are attending mainstream settings to access the curriculum. And then I have a role at Southern Support School, and Southern Support School is one of 3 dedicated special education settings in the state for students kinder through to year 12. I really love the diversity of my work, which has a common theme of ensuring that environmental information is accessible to learners, in addition to providing physical and social access. So the notion of inclusion for me starts with ensuring access or providing enabling environments. And I guess it's important to make the point, and you may well already understand, that very few people are totally blind. Even people with profound vision impairment will use their residual vision for really good practical purpose. For example, even having, bare light perception is really important for orientation and mobility. So therefore, our access methods might include visual means, so maximising the residual vision that's there through magnification, contrast, enhanced lighting, etc. But we might also use non-visual compensatory means such as tactile, braille or auditory options. So I work with children and young people from birth through to 18 years who have a wide range of visual conditions, disabilities and medical complexities. And this includes a condition known as cerebral visual impairment, also known as cortical vision impairment or brain-based vision impairment, or CVI. CVI is an umbrella term that refers to a constellation of higher order visual processing characteristics or behaviours. It's commonly caused by prematurity, but it can also be caused by events at or around the time of birth that reduce oxygen and nutrients to the baby's brain, and there are many other causes as well. Regardless of whether it's due to an eye problem or a brain problem, though, vision impairment is essentially an information disability. So when you have a vision impairment, you experience barriers to access to environmental information that's otherwise available to people who don't have a vision impairment. So given that we're all in the business of wanting children to learn, and given that the first step in cognitive development is the acquisition of sensory information, it's important that we maximise opportunities for access to information while we're also trying to mitigate barriers to access. And we can think about the obvious access considerations for people who are blind or have low vision, so things like braille label, accessible documents, screen readers, tactile ground surface indicators, rails, etc. But in addition to these important considerations, for people who have brain-based vision impairment, the environment itself is actually hugely important. So much so that the environment might actually determine whether or not the person can use their vision or not. So given this is Learning Environments Australasia meeting, I thought it was fairly important that I spoke a little bit about CVI. So the person with CVI might experience difficulties with visual recognition, that is understanding what things are. They might have difficulties with visual search, so using their vision to find things. They can have difficulties with visually guided movement, so using vision to direct their body through space, and difficulties with visual attention. And like I said, in particular, visual complexity or environmental clutter, if you like, is really one of the most important things to consider if you have, or if you're working with somebody who has characteristics of CVI. It can be a significant barrier to access. And just in case you think it's CVI something that affects just a handful of people, please reconsider. Studies have shown that 1 in 30 students in mainstream schools experience CVI-related vision problems, and the incidence prevalence is much, much higher in special needs settings. And it's thought that people with CVI have fewer white matter connections in their brains, so that information transfer is reduced and or less efficient. And to compensate for this reduced connectivity, people need more time, a stronger visual stimulus, and reduced competition for attention. So reducing visual complexity is a great strategy for reducing demands on attention and allowing the person to focus on the task that's presented to them. And an example that I gave at the symposium, and it's often given actually, is to think of an art gallery and how you feel in that quiet, calm, light and temperature controlled space, and how the environment and the presentation of the artwork actually allows you to appreciate what you're looking at, and then compare that to how you feel at your local shopping centre prior to Christmas, where it's just, full on crazy. And I suppose for children with CVI and for children generally, we want our learning environments to be more like the art gallery and less like the crazy shopping centre. And in fact, the same environmental modifications that suit children with CVI tend to suit everybody who is working in the space. And there's a range of adjustments for CVI that aim to make it easier for children to use their vision. I can direct you to different papers to talk about that. And just quickly to sum up, inclusion for me, I suppose, is less about student placement and providing the same educational experiences for all, and it's more about ensuring that that individual student engagement, and that can't happen unless the learning tasks and the learning environment is accessible for students.
Thanks, Beck. That's great. So impressed by your expertise. I was at the symposium and I'm impressed again. But what I want to do is, so thank you. What I want to do is just open up that kind of question. You started to touch on what some of the barriers to inclusion are for students with CVI. And I might just open that question up to Charlotte and Ange. We'll go with you first, Charlotte, and then we can come back, Beck, and give you a chance to have a think about some other things you might want to add to that. So Charlotte, what do you see as kind of, from your perspective as an OT and the work that you do, what do you see as some of the kind of the barriers to inclusion?
And I think it's really good to note that as an OT, we often look at the person, their environment, and their occupations. We look at how these three things constantly overlap for the student and how that then will impact on them actually being a student and accessing environments. So that's what we call the PEO model as an OT. But really, this transcends into that physical environment of the classroom environment and the entire school environment. So in terms of a physical barrier to the school environment, Beck, you've already touched on this, just that general accessibility, trying to enter buildings. But really, a really big one that I see working with a lot of children that are neurodivergent is also toilet spaces. So making sure that not only they're accessible in terms of spacing and allowances, but also when we think about lighting, when we think about automated flushes, when we think about how much control students actually have in that space, in that toilet or that restroom environment, I work with a lot of children that have quite complex needs and sometimes co-occurring anxiety. And sometimes if there's an automatic flush, or if there's an automatic hand dryer, or if there's an automatic tap, that can be enough for them to feel like they don't have control over the environment and feel very uncomfortable. Also, the sounds in those spaces. So really what I'm getting at is a lot of those really complex sensory environments, like the toilet, like classrooms, that can be a real barrier for some of the students. But another one that I'd like to touch on too quite early is outdoor play environments. So really thinking about this being something that is so important as a child, to be able to play and to be able to do what's important to you in the outdoor environment. So it can be as simple as having swings that are accessible for all students, or having ramps in the playground equipment, making sure that schools are easy for kids to get in and out of, and they're not going to get too fatigued going downstairs to get to different parts of the playground. So yeah, that's just outside of the classroom environment specifically. Yeah, barrier would be that the toilet spaces and the outdoor places. And just another one too would be just time and resources in general. So I've worked with so many teachers and educators who are really eager to really support students, put the adjustments in place for them, but without having the time dedicated to put the supports in place or to learn about the child's needs, that can be a real barrier to making sure that those adjustments are put in place for the student.
Yeah, I think we'll get a chance to come back to sensory needs, Charlotte, and I think we'll, in particular, start to have a really close think about or chat about what those adjustments are and what the really successful adjustments are, and then if you were to start from scratch, what would you like to see happen? But before we get into some of those kind of details, I'd like to just hand over to you, Ange, to respond to the same question.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Barriers to inclusion. There can be many, and I'll try and put a lens on it from a special school, but I'll try to reflect on mainstream too, so it stays relevant to everyone. We use an environmental audit at Verney Road, and we look at exactly what's in the classroom. Classrooms tend to get very busy, cluttered places, and it's a bit like what Charlotte was saying. We need to be really aware of that. So she was talking about, lack of control over things. If we don't do an environmental audit, if you don't have your schedules in place, if you don't have the right seating, if you don't have, all those things that are conducive, and how is that relevant when we're looking at how our classroom is structured? There has to be enough pin boards. There has to be, all those things, all those spaces for those things to work. What's really important is that any classroom space is flexible. So it can be developed and changed and adapted. So those adjustments can be put in all the time as needed for the cohort of children in there. And I think that's absolutely really important. So you might be looking at different seating, different tables, what suits the particular children at that time. Flooring is really important, and it really reminded me tonight there were 8 people around the table tonight at my school talking about one student and problem with transitions with this child, and we weren't getting them right. So we had our OT, our speech, our physio, the cohort there. And one of the things we were coming up with was flooring and changes in flooring. And, Charlotte's the OT, so she'll know more about this than me. But all those things are so incredibly important. Steps. And we even identified one of our bottom steps, the bark's gone under it and there's a bigger drop. So those sorts of things are absolutely important also. Sometimes in our outdoor play environments too, we get really keen on the next whiz-bang thing. Look, I even know we've made a mistake in our school. We've got this great rope swing thing. We never have any children on it. It was great for the first couple of weeks because it was new. Now we might get a few of the older kids sitting there hanging out, talking to friends. They don't use it. So being really careful and really mindful around those sorts of things are really important too, because we thought it was going to be a great thing that would really promote skills. What I haven't touched on at all is the cultural inclusion, and that's absolutely vital. So for our Koori kids, your yarning circles, etc. But the reminders all the time. There's one thing in our school particular, we have 2 flagpoles, not 3. And I'll just tell you a little story around inclusion. It won't take long. One of the students one day said to me, "Hey, Ange, I really want my flag." So he wanted Torres Strait Islander flag, and we had the other 2. And I looked at the flagpoles and I started explaining to him, "Mate, we're going to a new school. It would cost us a fortune, blah, blah, blah." And he walked away and I went, "What sort of an excuse is that?" So anyway, I got online. I'd seen flags with flagpoles before, and I got online. Within half an hour, I'd spent a couple of grand, but don't worry about that. And I had these portable flags, and I had these other things. Anyway, when they arrived, it didn't take long. I sent down to his classroom. I said, "Send this kid up." And he came up, and there were the flags, and he saw them. He's vision impaired, but he saw his flag there immediately. And he said to me, "This is the best day ever." So my message is sometimes the most simple things, don't put barriers in your way, just the simple things can make such a difference.
Yeah, that's a great story. Yeah, very simple, Ange. Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm wondering, any of you can jump in and answer this question. I'm really curious, during COVID, and it seems like no one wants to mention that anymore, or it's not popular, but heck, we can't ignore it, and the impact it had on schools. We had an unprecedented glimpse into home life. And I just wonder what you've learned about kind of inclusion and barriers to inclusion based on things you might have observed or seen during homeschooling, or how homeschooling started to impact your thinking around inclusion. So what do you reckon? Who wants to jump in? You can all have a go, no problem, but who wants to go first? Go, Charlotte.
I'll jump in. I was doing a lot of telehealth therapy with families during this time, and it just gave me so much insight into the home environment and how it was set up. And there were so many recommendations that I'd give with families when I was in the clinic. And then when all of a sudden it was online and I was given more access, children wanted to show me their lounge room and their play set outside. And it was just really opened up my eyes to the different environments that children are in at home and that students come from school, from home to school with. And that was really, really insightful for me. I do feel like as well, though, that COVID some of the positives from COVID is being able to provide webinars to schools that otherwise absolutely teachers wouldn't be able to access. They wouldn't all be able to gather in one spot. And also being able to have some more flexibility with telehealth appointments, I think, has been really helpful as a therapist working in schools as well.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Being able to see in sort of into people's homes is just really insightful on many levels. How about you, Beck or Ange?
It's tricky to answer this one, actually, because I don't know if you remember, but Tassie was sort of cut off from the rest of the world, even more than usual during COVID, because there was this sort of, people were prevented from coming into the state, and people who went out of the state had to quarantine when they came back, and it was all quite strange, I suppose. So we were sort of a little bit, I suppose you could say, lucky in a way that COVID didn't have the same effect on us as it might have done for people in other states. But just to follow on from what you said there, Charlotte, about the webinars, that's the thing that really stood out for me about COVID, was just the information sharing that happened during that time. And actually, as a result of one of the webinars that, was made available at that time, we got this program set up at Southern Support School, an eye care program, whereby people come now from the Royal Hobart Hospital to Southern Support School to improve access to eye care in the school. And it's just made a huge difference to, the educators' knowledge of how the students are using their vision. And when you think about it, a lot of the students who attend Southern Support School have autism. And so use of visuals is really, really important to communication. A lot of the communication systems are highly visual in nature as well. So understanding what the children can see and how they use their vision is really important. So I think that for me was like a huge sort of advantage from COVID that webinar happened, and as a result of that, it sort of initiated this eye care program that's making a huge difference for the children. So of
all the things that it's managed to kind of democratize knowledge further and share the knowledge where it's really needed and quite critical knowledge as well. Yeah, what an insight. And what about anything in particular that you might have learnt from home life from a student's home life that you has impacted what you implement or how you think about inclusion?
It changed us a lot. We did have some students on site the whole time, but then a lot of others we didn't, and it was really hard to access them and find out what was going on. What has changed is we've really gone to a wraparound the family approach, and that came out of that severe need for support for them. So we realised pretty early on it wasn't just about the education and maintaining that learning, it was around how the whole family was functioning. How that is relevant to this is that it has meant the demand on our school to be a community hub is huge. Well, currently, we don't have enough space to do that, but we will meet that need in our new school. And I think the schools I've seen that have been really successful coming out of COVID have been able to create that form of community. In some shape or form, they've been able to continue to engage their children, and that builds trust, and that means you've got attendance, you've got your kids there and they can learn. And I think it's really vitally important. When Shepparton flooded late last year, it was very easy for our school to respond to that need because we already had the experience of COVID. So it's just really cementing the absolute, as I see for inclusion, that absolute need to have that community hub where everyone in the community feels like they belong, that they're not going to be judged, and we can meet whatever need that is. And that could be sending food home, providing work, helping a parent, linking with other services, whatever it is. That
what does it mean for...
And I said the other day to someone, sorry, go on, Scott.
Sorry, Ange, I've sort of assumed you were winding up my mistake. What does that mean for the kind of spaces you're starting to think about for the new build, or for the redevelopment rather?
Or the redevelopment, definitely community hub, and those links with our allied health services, our links with our NDIS providers, wellbeing staff, etc., is what's vital, and that's what our families are really looking forward to. So to be able to have that space for them in the school where they also belong is really important.
Yeah, so COVID's kind of revealed this need for knowledge and that kind of critical nature of sharing it, and then sort of post-COVID, we're seeing schools act as kind of these hubs for a range of services, but also then to kind of continue to amplify the sharing of that knowledge. Yeah, great. I'm going to start asking some quite specific questions about the environment. And I'm going to sort of circle back a little bit to sensory needs, but I wouldn't mind putting outdoor learning spaces on the table as well. But feel free to answer this question as you like. But really, research from all around the world consistently points to the impact or the importance of sensory stimulation. That overstimulation is problematic and understimulation is problematic. But and that has a negative effect. What have you? And I know, Beck, you've started to mention this. What have you observed, and what might you recommend? I mean, I guess I'm starting to think about what are good versions of this, and then what are negative, or what versions of it are to be avoided. So, kind of when we start to really drill down to the practical, what's positive and what's negative? What have you seen in your experiences?
Did you want me to
jump in, Beck? Yeah, please. Thank you. So
as an itinerant teacher, I'm privileged, I guess, to visit lots and lots of classrooms, and I've been in some where, every wall space, every vertical space is covered with visual information, and there's things hanging from the ceiling, and it's sort of necessary to weave your way through all the furniture to get to where you want to go. And space behind the interactive whiteboards covered with stuff so that, if you're a child sitting on the mat, you've got to actually actively disregard all of that information in order to focus your attention on what the teacher's talking about. And then there are other classrooms where, the ceiling lights are just, this flickering sort of fluoro mess, and others where the glare's coming through the window and bouncing off all the reflective surfaces, and then there are the ones with the glass panels between the classrooms, so you can see all the busyness of what's going on in the next classroom, and there are advantages in all of those things for certain students. But I suppose, again, with the CVI vision hat on, the mainstay of adjustments for CVI is to make use of vision easier. So we want to reduce the demands on vision and reduce the number of things that children have to sort of attend to at any one time. So you make the thing they need to look at stand out and reduce all the other irrelevant information, reduce the unnecessary visual clutter and competing demands on attention. And those environments that I was just describing before really just serve to make the use of vision harder, not easier. So I suppose, I feel like I'm always going on about visual clutter and visual information, but it really is, if possible, really important to try and get rid of all of that stuff that's not necessary for the child to be looking at, and certainly provide that information, but it doesn't need to be there all the time. You can use, you can bring it out when it's needed, but put it away, cover up your shelves. Get rid of all the stuff on the walls that the child doesn't need to look at. I think it's just one of those things that's really fundamental, but makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
I feel like we're preaching the same message then, Beck. Because I feel like all the classrooms I go into, that's one of my top recommendations as well. Because as you said, it supports students with vision impairment, supports all the students that have additional needs really to focus on what they're needing. And I think practically speaking, a really big one I say often we go in is let's reduce the hanging work from the ceilings. So let's take that down and let's really think about those purposeful wall displays, as you were saying. So let's make sure that what we've got up is purposeful. Let's rotate through wall displays if we need them. I think a really good example of that is I went into a classroom a few months ago and it was the perfect classroom. The tables were set up so beautifully. I know the perfect classroom doesn't exist, but it was a very good one.
You're going to have to elaborate now, Charlotte. Everybody's listening.
Yeah, that's right. But it was so fantastic. I saw a student who actually who needed a little bit more learning support. He needed support with how to spell a word. And he got up from his seat and he walked over to a wall and he found the exact poster that he needed to, because he was so orientated to where things were in the classroom. And because the things that were on the walls were so purposeful, he knew exactly where to locate things, how to use them. And I think that is a really key reason to only have purposeful things up, because then they're actually useful and functional. If students aren't referring to them or they're not creating warmth in a space, then the benefit perhaps isn't there. And I think just circling back to what you said too, Beck, put things away. I really feel like in classrooms, everything needs to have a space and everything needs a place. Students need to be able to find them. Let's use visuals to make sure that students also know where to locate things. And everything needs to be able to be packed away as well. So that's just on that visual point too.
What about, I really want to start talking about clutter a little bit more generally, because one of the things that I've learned through researching in this space for the last 4 years is just the importance of storage as an articulation of the capacity to close things down and to reduce stimulation. So often storage and lockers and things are often, they're not, the first thing that everybody talks about or the favorite thing to talk about. But in the case of accommodating special educational needs students, particularly in special school settings, I found that to be absolutely critical for practice, totally critical. And so, Ange, I want to pass over to you and come back, Beck and Charlotte, if you've got a response to this too. But what other forms of clutter? What other ways can we use to reduce clutter if we kind of expand beyond that idea of just the visual, which of course, everything is, but are there other kind of things we need to start considering on that clutter, and how has that impacted your thinking about the new design, Ange?
Storage is an absolute key, but you also have to be careful. The more storage you give a teacher, the more they will collect. So it can be pretty tricky sometimes. Absolutely right. For students with autism, paring down that environment, avoiding that sensory overload, visual, and also for what they can hear is really important. I think one of the things we've learned is our school only 20 years old. I don't know what they were thinking, but really high ceilings and corridors. We actually don't transition our children down any of our corridors. They have external doorways, and they all go through the external doorways because they can't cope with the number of children around them, that physical proximity, of course, and they can't cope with the noise, and it's freezing cold in there, and all sorts of things. So that's one thing that we've sort of avoided in the new school, which raised a few eyebrows at times, less than traditional, but I think it will work for us. That's storage in other ways. The other thing that we're really doing, which is slightly sort of on the same topic, Scott, but it made me think of sensory rooms, and we've got a sensory room, but in the new school what we'll do is we'll integrate the sensory stuff. So again, it can be flexible and can meet the needs of the particular children in the classroom, rather than saying at the moment we've got a sensory room that's great for children, up to 8 or 9. The senior students aren't going to want to come over to a junior space or engage with the activities on offer in there. So that's something that we've learned that's really important also.
Could I just jump in there as well? Because, Angela, I think that's fantastic, as you're saying, that you've got the sensory room, but you're looking at these other spaces too. And I feel like those breakout zones are so helpful in schools. And I see that works so well in so many schools when they do have the space for that. So they've got a designated area. A lot of schools have calm corners, calm zones, zen dens that they've created more of an afterthought. But if you're able to create the spaces where there is enough space for that, I think that's amazing. The other thing that I really encourage with schools is having a movement zone, or somewhere where students can actually get some active movement to regulate, because we've got a lot of students that want to calm, but we've got a lot of students that need to feel more alert as well to be able to focus. I know we all have a range of sensory needs. Even within this conversation, there's so many different people with a range of needs. I myself seek a lot more movement than the average person my age, so I'll be moving my hands a lot, having a drink more, just really trying to maintain that right level of arousal for the task. So I think it's really important to accommodate for all of those needs. Another thing that I'd love to point out as well is to support students to really be at that right, to be regulated and in that state of regulation, is having tables and chairs that are the right size and height. So I know, Ange, before you mentioned having flexibility within things. So if the classroom might be a prep classroom this year and it might be a grade 3 classroom next year, we need to think about having tables that are height adjustable, so that students can actually have the correct posture with their feet flat on the floor, their back up straight, because it is really, really hard to focus if you can't even maintain your posture. Have a go of holding your legs off the ground and not having support underneath you. It is very challenging. And then you're trying to do other tasks like drawing, colouring, cutting, concentrating, reading. It's very challenging. So that's another really big thing as well, just those tables and chairs and having different heights available for different sized children.
Charlotte, can I also mention making sure you're integrating in every space for people who use wheelchairs, because time and again, if you don't, they'll be on a table on their own or no table or whatever and can't be part of the group, and it's really not okay at all. Yep.
Absolutely, and I'd say that goes across mainstream environments too, definitely. Thanks for that, Ange.
Yeah, too right. I'm going to jump into the Q&A. We've got a couple of questions from the crowd, the audience. So thank you for sending these in. They're really good questions. One from Johnson. who's asking, and this perhaps is for you, Beck, but feel free to jump in, Ange and Charlotte, is are there any colours that we should avoid to prevent sensory overload?
That is a good question. If you read the CBI literature, there's a lot of talk about the fact that some colours are better for children with CBI in the sense that they might be more likely to attract visual attention. And often, it's red and yellow that are the two colours that are supposedly, best at, attracting visual attention. In practice, it's quite tricky to sort of measure that, to be really objective about it. And often it comes down to sort of what people say the child is more sort of likely to look at, rather than having any kind of, objective measure of that. In terms of what colours to avoid, I think there might not be any specific colour that should be avoided, but if you think about trying to avoid visual complexity, I suppose what you're wanting to avoid is just like a mishmash of different colours and different sort of patterns and, really trying to sort of reduce pattern and variation, I guess, in the sort of non-essential visual field and just sort of bringing the attention of the child to the thing that you really want them to look at. So we often talk about sort of covering desks with some kind of plain dark background, or covering shelves with, black tablecloths if you can't put cupboard doors on things, just covering all that stuff up, so that the thing that you really want the child to attend to stands out from the background. So it's not so much that you are using a particular colour, but the thing that you're wanting the child to look at is sort of enhanced by the fact that the background is not attractive, and you can use lighting to sort of, again, bring the attention to the particular object that you want them to concentrate on. So that didn't really answer that question, but hopefully that was somewhat useful.
Can I add to that also? I think, as you were saying, lighting is absolutely vital there, and being able to have dimmers is really, really good, and blinds. So certain times of the day, pulling the blinds down so you're not getting overstimulation and glare, because that will absolutely dysregulate some children. So that sort of flexibility again. And it's always about weighing up everyone's needs, isn't it? So if you've got a flexible space, then you can provide that contrast and that brightness that's needed for a student with vision impairment. But at the same time, you can have another area that will meet another child's needs, that they might need a bit more quieter or a bit more darker space for a period of time.
We've had a question that it's the equivalent around the audio environment. Is anyone aware of any of the research? There's certainly some research indicating that it is a distraction, but from the research that I've done looking at the literature, I haven't done a deep dive on the audio. Anyone done a bit of work on that? Thank you for your question, Peter. And how are you, Peter? David, this might be an opportunity for you to jump in and answer a question.
Yeah, I'm not an academic, but I get advised by various people that I'm involved with, including some people at the University of Queensland. Certainly in the context of autism, the concept of capturing a voice or capturing a screen audio and broadcasting it evenly throughout the room is not for everyone. There was a study done, I would suggest 5 years ago, that said it's something you should think about and have available to you, but in some cases, some children don't like it. More broadly speaking, my experience with special ed and actually reducing the volume at which a teacher speaks, that is, the microphone does the work. Think of it as power steering for your voice. We have little pushback in our experience that is a derogatory outcome or an undesired outcome. But certainly, the most recent study I've seen in terms of autism has basically says it's case by case. The VSBA rules actually require, and we have a solution for it, where you can add that facility to the infrastructure of the building when you need it and take it out when you don't. So it's not something you need to overspend on. There is a way of achieving that outcome without costing $1 million. Does my view replicate others on the panel here? Is that your experience?
I can add something there, David. It's not quite exactly along the same lines of what you were talking about, but again, with the CVI kind of lens over things, one thing that is really important for lots of children is just to separate out the different sensory pathways. So if the intention is for a child to look at something, then you want them to be able to look without also needing to listen, because that parallel processing can be really tricky. So it's not to say that a multisensory approach is bad. You still provide a multisensory approach, but you just separate out vision and hearing so that they can be done separately and not sort of overloading the attention.
Sure.
So we've seen a series of insights around sensory needs, clutter. We've got some ideas around designs and complexity and those sorts of things. Is it reasonable to then say, okay, all these things now apply to outdoor learning environments, or is there a particular kind of sensitivity or a particular kind of approach we need to take when we start to consider outdoor learning environments? Who'd like to go first? Ange, what about you? You're in the middle of design.
Well, the outdoor environment, I think one of our major things is that connection to the outdoor environment, and particularly for students who become dysregulated and need that connection so that they can go immediately out, they can regulate. We do have trampolines, swings, etc., that are available to them readily, so that can meet their need. And for the children who need that extra activity, that can be provided too. So that absolute connection, and having the playground down the back of the school or, away from classrooms is probably not an ideal structure to be able to achieve that. So the use of courtyards and being able to individualise what you put in them, again, for your particular class is, I think, a really good way of going also. And that's what we've been looking at. And other things, just that different experiences. So, your water, your sand, your plants, what have you got there that will give that sensory feedback to students. So on our current site, we have a sensory garden. It's not that sensory anymore because it's right on the corner of what are now two very busy roads, but you'll still find a lot of some of the children who are seeking that little bit of quiet time sitting down there quietly, etc. So those different spaces that meet different needs.
Yeah, fantastic. How about you, Charlotte? Beck, have you got anything to add to that?
Definitely, Angela, as you were saying, in those breakout spaces, having that different equipment available is fantastic. And I think back to your question, Scott, is it the same? It's probably not the same, because often the purpose of being outside is around regulation and play, whereas in the classroom, sometimes it is a little bit more structured. But maybe that's, maybe that I'm answering my question as I'm talking as well. Maybe it is actually the same. But I think really thinking as well about activities outside that are alerting and fun and energizing, such as playground equipments or different opportunities. And then also thinking about calming experiences, so passive play options, more structured lunchtime programs and clubs are for students that need to access them too or want to access them. For some students, being outside can be quite dysregulating because there's so much noise, there's so much clutter, there's so many people, there's so many social expectations. So it can actually be far more calming for them to have somewhere like a sensory garden to go to, or to have a structured Lego club to attend that might be outside or it might be inside. So that flexibility from staff and having those options is really important.
Yeah. How about you, Beck? The outdoor environment is often brighter and more stimulating generally and you can't kind of control the variables, or can you? Like, what would you recommend?
Gosh, I'm not sure I can add a lot to what Ange and Charlotte have already said, but really just to sort of focus on the flexibility and, the flexibility of different sort of lighting areas and, the wider open spaces, but, other spaces that feel a little bit more sort of, close and familiar and safe, I suppose. And then, of course, you can put your environmental access report hat on and talk about, making sure that any poles are marked properly and, lips and edges and, you've got your bumpy dots and whatnot in the right places and that kind of thing. So, yeah, I guess for me, it would be about flexibility to enable students to sort of seek out the spaces that felt right for them at those particular moments that they were out there.
What about sort of the pause spaces or calming spaces that Ange mentioned? Is there a need for those spaces to be slightly darker or have kind of how do you achieve the equivalent of kind of, dimmable lights in an outdoor environment? Have you seen anything like that, or has that emerged as an issue for you in the work that you do?
For me, in the work that I do, not really. There's certainly a number of students who have vision conditions that are either so they're definitely affected by light. So some students are day blind, if you like, and others have night blindness. So their vision will be much better in one of those two sort of lighting environments. And for those students, you have to modify the light by different sort of lens tints or, providing sort of shaded areas, or actually enhancing the lighting in different sort of ways. But I wouldn't say that I've seen any sort of specific outdoor design area that's been modified for children with a particular sort of visual focus. Our adjustments have mainly been related to how that student can sort of modify the light to suit their own particular needs.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. This is a very kind of designy question, and I'm thinking of the architects in the audience when I ask it. And in fact, all of you have mentioned kind of proximity as being a really interesting factor when you're thinking about stimulation spaces or outdoor environments. So some of the research indicates that it would be better to be closer, that these things need to kind of be at hand. What have you seen that have been successful? Or I think, Ange, you mentioned the idea of an unsuccessful space being an environment tucked all the way down the back that students have to transition to. What are your insights and thoughts on the idea of having these kinds of stimulation environments or outdoor environments close by to the classroom?
I think that having them accessible and close to the classroom, it becomes integral, so the learning can be inside or outside. Like it should be fluid anyway. So I think it's really important. But then again, we've got that flexibility, so that comes in. So some students are going to need to be able to get away. So to be able to take them to another space where they feel safe. One example in our school is, and it'll just give you an idea, we're just so crowded at the moment that it's almost impossible to really meet the needs. So you just become really flexible. So under the table, a child might choose under the table. So how can we do that? How can we do that in a safe way so we know where the child is, but it's still meeting their need? So sometimes that's absolutely okay, and it doesn't have to be over-engineered or anything else. It meets that need, and if that's in their behaviour plan, then that's absolutely okay. It's meeting that need. So that's what we would do.
Anything to add there, Charlotte? No pressure.
Could you repeat the question again? Sorry.
We're really just talking about kind of the idea of proximity. So if we're thinking again on outdoor environments, and that there's this a disadvantage to having them a long way away, but there's an advantage to having them there, an apparent advantage to having them close by. I'm really just wondering if you might comment from your experience. What have you seen that's been successful? What have you seen that's been unsuccessful?
Yeah, I think any way you can limit a transition in a school saves everyone a lot of time. And lots of these students that require these spaces, transitions are challenging in general. So transitioning to a new space is very hard. Lots of students have mobility concerns as well. So it's fatiguing to have to transition to a whole new space. So definitely I would echo the discussion around having really accessible spaces that are in the classroom. So I don't actually have to leave the classroom to regulate. I can regulate within my own space. I can access what I need within the space. I might be at the back of the classroom. I might be sitting down in a beanbag, but I'm still listening. And I'm actually still taking in a lot of what the teacher is saying. Or I might be walking and doing some laps at the back of the classroom and stretching some TheraBand, but I'm taking in every single word of the discussion up the front. So I really feel that having those options available in the classroom, having sometimes breakout spaces too, where students can go outside and enter back in, can be really helpful.
Yeah. Yep. Thank you.
Also, Charlotte, Scott, you just reminded me also in our current school, our art room and our hall for PE are way away from everywhere else, our music room, etc. So what happens is we don't use them, and we bring art and music to them more than we don't, because the students can't handle, especially the younger they are, they can't handle the transitions. So we've certainly onto that in the new school, and trying to create those sort of hubs in a much more accessible space.
And I think too, Angela, that's really, really key, because it's the transition, and it's also the specialist classrooms need to have access to the exact same supports that the students have access to within their own classrooms. And sometimes I see that in schools where the regular classroom environment is set up so well for the students' needs, but as soon as they go to that other space, nothing is in place for the student. And we wonder why the student really struggles to go to that class or go to that subject. And it's because we've lost every adjustment in the physical environment as well as in the support.
We've got a tricky question from Ben in the Q&A. So I'm going to give you a little moment to think about it. And I know, and thank you for the question, Ben. And I know it's really critical to successful research in this area. But how can people with lived experience of disability best be involved in school design? If you need a moment to think about that, I'll ask a different question, and you feel free to answer this one first. My question towards the end was going to be, what tips do you have for teachers? Do you have a sort of a top 5 tip set of tips? You can either answer either of those, or we can how about we answer that question first about tips for teachers, and then we'll come back to Ben's question, which I think deserves a bit of consideration, but it may be something that's slightly out of your expertise. Maybe not. I'm not sure. We'll just wait and see. So what about top 5 tips for teachers? Well, you don't have to have 5. Beck, what?
Scott, can I answer a different question?
Why not? Go for it.
It's kind of like top tips for teachers, I suppose, but it's just a success story that I think has a lot of value, and you know, you can take your top tips from it. But recently I was asked to assist the teacher librarian at Southern Support School. So there was a new library space set up, and she'd asked me to come and have a look at it because she was experiencing some challenges, including sort of various behaviours like sweeping all the books off the bookshelf onto the floor. And it hadn't happened once, it had happened, you know, numerous times with different students. And there were students that were just really not engaging with the whole process, especially the borrowing side of going to library. And although there are a few students at Southern Support School who have a diagnosis of CBI, lots of them don't, and that's, you know, a bigger problem. But we would imagine that there are lots of students attending Southern Support School who probably have characteristics of CBI. And one of the characteristics that's frequently discussed is simultaneous agnosia, which just means that you can't visually attend to more than one thing at a time. So in a visually complex environment, you can imagine that becomes even harder. And we were thinking about the books on the shelf, and we're thinking that for somebody who has visual processing problems, they may not even be able to tell that there are individual books on the shelf. They might just look like a conglomerate of, colour and shape, and really it's just sort of one blob of something as opposed to individual books, because really all you're seeing is the spine of the book on the shelf. And then the other thing that they have in the library, or they had in the library, were these big sort of wooden tubs that had different recesses in them, and the books were sort of stacked one in front of the other. And a lot of the students didn't have the, the physical capability to sort of sort through those books. And again, regardless of whether you were ambulant or in a chair, you look down on those books, and again, you can't tell them necessarily that they're individual books. They just look like one blob of something. So what the teacher ended up doing was to remove all of the books from the tub except for one book in each recess. So there was just a space, and one book was placed in there. And rather than expecting the children to go to the bookshelf, they dedicated an entire wall to book display, but the books were one at a time, and there was a lot of space around each book. And the books were at different heights, so that children, regardless of whether they were using a wheelchair or they were ambulant, they were able to sort of get up close to them and, really sort of investigate each book individually. And lighting was used as well to sort of highlight different books, and it's made a huge difference. So all that sort of behaviour from different children sweeping the books off the shelf has ceased, and children have started engaging with the whole borrowing process. So they're not having to just sort of have a teacher assistant say this one or this one, which one do you want? They're actually going to the books on the display and choosing for themselves. And I just think that it's a really powerful story, because it, not much has changed. It's just the presentation of things has changed, and yet it's made a really big difference to access and engagement of the children in that space.
That's a wonderful story. That's fantastic.
Sorry, I didn't answer your question. But
No, I think you're right, though. We can take our tips from that as we will. I think that's really a powerful anecdote, Beck. Thank you for sharing. That's really good. Yeah, really practical. There's some really practical ideas for libraries and for general learning environments and other areas. That's great. I'm just sort of, as you were talking, I was also imagining different kind of school entrances that I've seen before that aren't informed by the kinds of insights that we can take from that anecdote. That's fantastic. How about you, Charlotte or Ange? I mean, I think we can go with the idea of a story, or you could land on some tips. I don't mind. We're in your hands.
For me, tips are pretty simple. I'd say, first of all, make sure you've got a line of sight into the classroom in terms of what do you want it to look like. And until you know what you want it to look like in terms of how are they going to learn and what does that look like, you're going to be floundering. And my other tip is just be brave. Go out on a limb, try something. But it's really important to just have that courage. And if you keep the child at the centre, you really won't go wrong.
I'm going to push you a little bit further on that, Ange. I know you like the idea of being able to define a classroom, and I know you've done a bunch of really impressive work on thinking about the kind of the spaces. What have you landed on as being a good space? Can you give us a little bit more detail on that?
So if I talked you through a classroom, visual supports for the children that are readily accessible. So whether that's, interactive whiteboard, etc. A variation in seating. So, and I can remember going through this activity with you, Scott, and it was absolutely fantastic, and getting staff to actually put things down and make it, and really challenge their thinking around that. So making sure you've got the right seating, but that it's flexible. And one of those things was, and I still can't break this barrier down, but I'd really love for a teacher to take it on, is, do you actually need, if you've got 10 children, do you actually need 10 seats? Or do you not? And what else could you do? So that's really important. I think zoned areas that are zoned, and that could be done in carpet, different colours, if you've got carpet squares, or it could be done with paintwork. It doesn't have to be, again, different inbuilt areas, etc. And make sure you've got space for the withdrawal areas, etc. But what's really important is that the children feel like they belong, and that they love their space. So that voice, and I think that goes to, was it Ben's question also, about that voice, is really important.
All right, Charlotte, your turn. And then I might ask and see if you do have any response for Ben. Had a chance to have a think now, but you can answer the tips one first, Charlotte.
Sure. I feel like I would say many of the tips that have already been mentioned as well, but definitely thinking about regulation as a whole and having that the priority for the children in the spaces. So thinking about those breakout zones for students, and not just having that for some students, really encouraging that for all the students, so that it's something that we do, that we tune into our bodies and what we need, and we access what we need so that we can be in the best state we can be to learn. Another thing that I would definitely say as well to Ange is that flexible seating. So for flexible seating, and then also thinking about when we have those tables and chairs, making sure that children are supported posturally. Thinking about just being flexible and having options within classrooms. So whether it is having those blinds, or whether it is having more control over the toileting environment, or whether it is a child being able to choose where they sit. So just really being flexible within those spaces, and that comes back to the lighting as well, having options over dimmers. So all of those options really support the space to be used as well as it can be. I also would say line of sight's really important, but also not being afraid of where you can to use doors and shut doors to reduce the sound that is filtering in from outside of spaces, whether that's from the corridor, whether that's from outside, whether that's from the classroom that's adjoining. So really thinking about how you can support students that are sensitive to sound to just be able to focus on what they need to within the classroom, rather than all the competing noises and sounds in the background. And that decluttering, so going back and having a look at your classroom and getting rid of all the things that you don't need in the space, and being really purposeful with how you use the space. But I think that all leads back to Ben's question too, is how can people with lived experience of disability be best involved in school design? And really, I feel like this sounds simple, but we need to ask people. We need to ask people that are in the school, what's your experience of school? How can we make it better? What can we do better? What's going to help you to enjoy school more, or get more out of the environment, or feel more engaged? So asking our students that are at the school is really important, and then engaging other advocacy groups too. So whether it's engaging groups such as Aspect or the ICANN network, and really talking to these really amazing people that just have a wealth of information for us, so that we can be open and learning together in the process as well, to support all of our students.
Fantastic. Ange?
Look, I agree totally with Charlotte in that consultation. We've certainly asked some of our staff, etc., and families, and we consult quite broadly on that. I think one of the things we've got to remember is that we've got a fair cohort of students with disability who have no voice, and the only way they can tell us how they feel or what they're thinking is through their behaviour. And I know we've got it right in terms of design for them, and how we're structuring their learning in their classroom is when they're regulated and when they're learning. And that's absolutely vital, that we don't forget their voice in all of that.
Yes. How about you, Beck?
I just completely agree with Charlotte and Ange that, seeking that that voice of lived experience when that's possible to do so, or potentially through proxy, I guess, consulting with families of students who may not necessarily be able to use their voice, but seeking that kind of input might be helpful, but also just, as Charlotte said, seeking input from people who have that sort of authentic lived experience and, hearing from them directly. I think, you can't really go past that.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that's part of the cornerstone of the research that Ben is doing at Learn. And so I'm quite excited by that. And I think that this space generally needs to be better serviced by the kind of research that is now going to happen, that is based on the experiences of the insights from people with experiences of disability, with research that looks at exactly what you were talking about, Ange, what happens when people are in that kind of regulated state for long periods, and then what are the factors that go into that. We really are at the end of time. Thank you so much for everybody who has attended tonight. We really appreciate you coming along. Thank you so much to Beck and Charlotte and Ange for your expertise and your willingness to share. We really appreciate it. I've learned heaps again this evening, and I'm kind of excited for the work that is going to be happening across the next little while, but also the next long while, because I don't think this is an area that is going away. This is an area that has a policy focus, that has a funding focus, clearly has a human need, and we're all engaged in that. So I think all of those things coming together make the next kind of 10 years, 50 years even more exciting. So I'm really pleased that we were able to capture some of your insights tonight. I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming along. Thank you to David from Here and Learn for the sponsorship tonight. I really appreciate that. And thank you for jumping in with a bit of audio expertise as well. Really auditory expertise. Really appreciate that. It's 7 o'clock, so we're going to sign off. Thank you very much for coming along, everybody. And we'll see you next time.